on pre-sales back in 2016, so 6 years ago. I joined the APEX development team, and since then I'm focusing on APEX, on development of the APEX engine, and I'm touching a number of areas, which is REST integration, which is data loading, which is also internal SQL execution for APEX components like interactive report, faceted search, and many other things. And today's session is especially about that topic, because in the meantime, and let me turn off camera to save on bandwidth now and share my stuff. And the topic which I brought for today is, where was my presentation? Here is my presentation, is faceted search, pivot, JSON, and more. I hope everybody can see my screen okay. And I will show you a bit how APEX executes SQL, and not only how APEX executes SQL, what APEX does with the SQL you guys are providing for your APEX components. So you know that situation, right? You are creating an interactive report and you provide a report query, of course. And then you get the columns from Page Designer, you configure the columns, and then you run the page and you see results. But what happens here? And especially then in the end user role, you are adding an aggregate, you are adding a chart, a highlight, a group by view, a preview. What happens here, right? APEX does something to fulfill all these requests, but what does APEX do? We will have a look into these things today, and not only into interactive report, we will also have a look in faceted search, into pivot clause, what does APEX do with JSON, and a bit of other stuff. And I will not only show you what APEX does, I will also show you how you can find out actually. If you are in an area which I didn't touch today, there is always a way to find out, and we will have a look into what you can do to learn about what APEX does to execute your components and to bring results on the screen. I was already saying I'm a member of the development team. My email address is here, and my Twitter handle is in the lower left corner. So whenever you have a question, even afterwards, after this presentation, feel free to drop me an email, reach out to me on Twitter, or raise if your question, if you have a topic which requires a bit more explanation, then it's most often more feasible to raise that on the APEX discussion forum, right, which allows you to provide all that context, and you can also tag people there. Okay, a first bit about what APEX actually is. So let me go through that rather quickly. And that's, but it's important because that's the goal of whatever we provide in APEX, right? We want to get you into the situation that you can eliminate code, right? And whenever you find yourself doing repetitive, low-level technical tasks, that's stuff which we are interested in, right? That is stuff which is a potential feature in APEX. So if you find yourself coding some low-level SQL, right? For instance, to bring an example, when we introduced REST support 5 years ago, we found that our customers were building code to do an HTTP request, to parse the JSON, and to drive and to provide that data to an APEX component. That was low-level code, which we've seen our customers were doing over and over again, and that inspired us to introduce REST data sources, which takes all that stuff away from you. And the same thing is for a component like faceted search, where there is a lot of building SQL to count stuff, to filter stuff. All this low-level stuff, that's something we are interested to add to APEX, right? So APEX is the Oracle strategic low-code tool. You know that you're working with APEX. And what I'm also showing you today, you can see how APEX does a pivot. So you don't need to be an expert in how to build a pivot clause, for instance, with SQL. APEX does it for you. On the other hand, you can use APEX to become an expert in these things, because APEX shows you how things work, and you can use that to learn, right? And that also allows you to apply SQL in areas where maybe APEX does not enough. Right? Maybe you find a limitation in the pivot clause of APEX, and you would like to do it on your own and go beyond these limitations. And today's session will show you how you can use APEX also as sort of an instructor. Let APEX explain you how SQL works and what SQL can do for you, right? So the general APEX architecture also as a very brief wrap up, and also with the important point, which is super important for today's session. Everything happens in the database. This is something I think, even if when you're talking with other colleagues about application architectures, the fact that APEX runs inside the database cannot be emphasized enough, right? A SQL query is cheap for APEX. There is no JDBC or PHP connection to the database, which goes over the network, which has round trips, and which is thus expensive. So all the Java, PHP, and other developers are typically striving to reduce database connections because they have learned that a database connection is expensive. Executing a SQL comes at significant cost. Not so in APEX, right? We all know executing a SQL, the overhead of executing a SQL is almost zero because we are already in the database. And so our goal as APEX developers is to write efficient SQL, to really leverage what the database can do for us. As soon as we are able to utilize efficient SQL for our problem, for our requirement, then we are on a good track, right? Because executing that SQL comes at almost no additional cost. And if the SQL as such is also efficient, leverage database capabilities, we have a winner. We already have a winner then, and that's something you can really do with APEX. But what do I tell you? Right? You know all this. You are doing this every day. So let's get started. And I will jump into demonstration mode right from the beginning. And I have an APEX workspace here, and I prepared a bit of an APEX application to start jumping into a few features. And let's first start very simple with an interactive report. Right, here is our interactive report. Let me come on. I need that screen sharing bar is in the wrong place. So let me first have a look what happens here, right? So when we look at Page Designer, then we can see we have an interactive report directly on the M table, right? Not even a SQL query, it's just directly on the M table. Right? So let's now do a bit with that interactive report, and let's now start super simple, all right? Let's just filter, and I'm filtering for the salary. Oh, let's not filter for the salary, let's use the job, that's better. All right, so now very simple filter, and you might already ask the question, what happens now? What did APEX do here? We can imagine what it did, right? It probably added a SQL filter before that clerk, but we don't want to believe or to assume, we want to know. And so we need to find out now what SQL APEX actually executed. And there is a very easy way to find that out, and that is called debug mode. And once you turn on debug mode, the page will reload, and we can click on View Debug. All right, and here is our the debug output for our page view, and you can review that. So you get a chart about the time breakdown, and you need to scroll a bit. It's a lot of information. Not only about the SQL, it's for the full page, right? Every component, whatever APEX did for that page, information is logged. And we need to scroll down a bit to get to the interesting pieces. And there we are, right? And we can also see that it's a bit more than just adding a filter, right? The basic thing is just this one. That is the select star from M, which APEX made out of the fact that you created the interactive report based on the M table. But there is also all that stuff here, and our filter is here, but still there's more. And when we look at the department column, we can see, oh, that's right, the M table contains numeric values here, and there is a foreign key to the depth table. And we can already see that has been resolved here. So let's have a look into Page Designer again and review the depth no column. And the depth no column is of the type plain text based on list of values. So we have a list of values here, and so that the column shows us the actual department names. And that declarative configuration is translated to SQL, which we can see here. And the name column is now, so we have here is our LOV definition. And what APEX does, it takes takes the LOV definition and joins that to the main report query. So we have the data source as the emp table and the LOV table, and that is joined, right? So the next thing is that columns might be set to hidden. Columns might be disabled by authorization. Columns might be conditioned out, right? And depending on how you configure the column, a column might be available, let's say, for computations here or not. For instance, if I condition that column, let's say the hire date, let me unauthorize that column. So we take it out and not administration rights. So I'm now not allowed to see that column anymore. The hire date went away. And when I now look review debug again, right? We'll scroll down a bit. We can see that the column was removed from these outer queries. So what APEX does, APEX has some generic logic which applies to all page components, which takes the basic query and then based on the column configuration, right? Think about it like an onion, like an onion with many layers, right? And the most inner layer is your report query. And based on LOV definitions, based on column authorization conditions, we have onion layers around it, which then hide columns away. An unauthorized column is only available to a certain layer. A hidden column is available longer, so a hidden column is available for computation, but it's not visible anymore. And so you can imagine that the SQL is like an onion, and at specific layers of the onion, columns are available or they go away. And that's the reason why you see that bit of a more complex SQL here. And you might ask yourself, oh, why all that complexity? There is a reason for that, right? And even this is important because, as you can see, we create the filter on the display column of the LOV. So that filter is not even created on the depth no column, it's created on the display column. So again, we need to have the LOVs merged in an early phase, and then the filters are applied in a later phase on a layer which is more in the outer areas of the onions. So that's the basic thing, all right? So how APEX executes SQL. And you can always find out the SQL by using debug node. But there is even a bit more to this. And I now enable debug at the default level, which is informational. And as we have seen, it provides us a decent amount of debug information, right? We basically see the query. And here is a bit of debug output from when results have been processed. But we can also get more, right? So let's assume we run into performance issues with our query. We want to know what's the execution plan. And you don't need to extract the query and to run it somewhere else. You can actually get the execution plan from APEX, right? Just turn debug to level 9. Level 9 is the highest debug level we have. It's also called trace debugging. And that will give us most possible information. And we can see the difference, right? Before it was 140 debug entries, and now it's almost 1,000. And this clearly tells us, oh, a lot of information is here, right? Here is probably where, so output is much more granular. And this is, looks like a giant gap, but it's on a small scale, right? The whole page just took a second to execute. And also a lot of that is, that's the important big thing for trace debug. You always see that logging itself also comes at a cost. But we are not interested in timing here. We are interested in the detailed information. So again, let's scroll down a bit until we see the SQL query. And let's now see what the trace level does for us. So there we are. That's what we've seen before, right? The SQL query executed for the interactive report. And here we also see a second query, and that also shows us what APEX did to implement the pagination. So the interactive report, you have pages. The first page shows only up to 50 rows. Then you can advance in the pages, and that is also implemented with SQL. And here is the interesting bit, right? This is what APEX also always does if you turn on level 9 debug. Right after the query executed, APEX grabs the execution plan. The actual execution plan for that query is grabbed out of the cursor cache and added to the debug log. And here is also what you need to be careful, that grabbing that execution plan comes at a cost, right? So the total times of a level 9 debug are always a bit skewed. But you get that information. And this is the execution plan which APEX actually, which the database actually used when that interactive report query was executed, right? And we can clearly see no index usage, probably because of the undep tables. They are rather small. And probably I can't even remember whether these tables have indexes. And but you can clearly see what happens, and you can take, if required, you can take action. Right. So this is your basic tool set. So whenever you want to know what happens when a query is executed, either you're asking yourself, why is my query slow? You ask yourself, how does APEX do that? Debug is the way for you to find out. And let's now have a look into our first more complex example. And let me take the filters out. And I would like to show you now also a simple example, right? But let me now add an aggregation. So we want to aggregate on the salary, right? And we can now see the sum of the salary here. So, and let's now, of course, everybody knows how the sum function works. And let me now play a bit in SQL Workshop to see what our options are here. So, and I've prepared a few queries which we now can run. All right, so let's first select this does not take into account all the APEX addition yet, but we can get an impression about what's happening here. Right? So this is just the basic query, and we have seen that in the interactive report, just the 14 rows. Let me then play with an aggregation. So this is how we would calculate the sum, right? So here is our value, and that's the same value we are seeing in the interactive report here. And we can also make that picture complete. Let's add another aggregation for the commission column. Sum and the commission column. And there we are, it's the 2,200. And those are the two values. But you can already see what happens here. I needed to execute two queries, right? One gives me the data, the other one gives me the aggregation. And one option would be, of course, to combine those with some union OR. And this would give us the data. And at the last row, we see our aggregation. Let me take out that no equals 30. And we can see our aggregation here, right? So that could potentially work. But what if we did that, right? So then it becomes, of course, we can do a group by, right? Right, that's what we could do. And now we have our sums for the depth node that could potentially all work. On the other hand, there is always one issue with that approach, because we are actually executing two queries. We are just passing one combined query to the database, but whenever there is a union construct, the database executes each query separately and then merges the results, right? That always happens, right? So as soon as you have union, you have multiple queries. There is no other way around this. And so for the end table, it wouldn't matter. But if you have a larger table or a complex query, this would quickly become very inefficient. So what I can tell you is that's not how APEX does it. APEX does it differently. We can also use analytic functions. And let me bring up that example. So this it's a different approach, right? We are selecting the data, and then we are providing our aggregates as separate columns, which of course leads to a repetition of these numbers, but that is in the end always cheaper than executing multiple queries. So and we are anyway in the database. So that's what we learned before. So the cost of selecting a value multiple times isn't that much, unlike for a PHP or a Java application. All these values would need to be transferred to the client, which doesn't happen for APEX. So APEX can afford this. Providing these values for every row comes at almost no additional cost. So, and it's now, if we have a look into the executed query, we can see that APEX took exactly that approach, right? So we have the sum of the salary as an analytic function, and as I also add in a control break, we use analytic clauses to get that value for each department number. The same is for the commission. And then there is also the control break itself, which APEX, and that for that reason, APEX orders the results by depth node, so that the interactive grid component can see when a component, when one control break ends and the next starts, right? And this is, you can also, if you're interested, you can always copy that statement out and run it here. And that's what we can see here. So we have our accounting with the aggregate for the department accounting, the second for research, and the third. And this is how APEX actually executes an aggregate function. And the lesson learned is, so whenever you need an aggregated value together with the actual data value, which we have here, right, the individual rows plus the aggregations, right, then analytic functions come to your rescue, because those allow you to compute aggregates along with the data, unlike a plain aggregate function where the query only provides the aggregated values, right? Okay, let's have another view. And while we are within interactive report, let's have a look into the pivot, which is quite a powerful feature of interactive report. And let's do the typical example, right? Let's now, let's pivot out the job column. So the job column, the values of the job columns are to become our new columns. The values of the department column are to become our new rows. And the cell values, if you will, are the sums of salary by job and department. Right? And we can add a total in as well. And that's what we get, right? A typical pivot view. And again, the question is, how does APEX do that? And we now know how these things work. Debug will tell us. And let's review debug output again. And we can see that, and that's the interesting thing now, that APEX executed this query. Right, and you can see there, and this is basically a usage of the SQL pivot clause. This is the interesting keyword here. And as this is a quite complex example, let's work with a simpler one. Right, again, I prepared a bit of this. And here is the very simple example of that pivot clause. Let me run that in SQL Workshop. And we see exactly the same result here. And the pivot clause was introduced back with database 11, so should be available to everyone. And the pivot clause does exactly this thing on a SQL level, and this is the sweet thing to do, right? Because it all happens in the SQL layer. So the data is processed where the data is, and no additional data leaves the SQL execution area, if you will. And you can look up. There is an excellent blog post about the pivot clause from Tim Hall. You might have a look into that one. And there is an interesting bit here, right? This is the base query. So you have to select the minimum required column, and we need the depth node, the job, and the salary. That's what we need for this pivot clause. And then you select the row column, right, and the pivoted columns. So, and the interesting thing is that these are actually values of our table, right? So we can select a value as a column, and that mapping of a value to a column name happens here. That's the part of the pivot clause. So the value of analyst is projected as the analyst, and I could also do something like that, and that also work, right? So this is the mapping clause, which projects a specific column out, and then it becomes available as the select column. But in order to build that, we need to know all these values, of course, right? And that's the reason, if we now have a look into the query again, why APEX actually does two queries here. And we can see that it does select distinct from job. And that's the first query for a pivot clause. We need to know the values. We need to know what pivot columns we have at the end of the day. And again, a pivot clause you could also, and that's the reason why we have to execute it on the original query, I could also have this one, right? So the department could also be my pivot column. And you can see that we now see the LOV return columns, right? So in order to determine these values, the whole interactive report query needs to be resolved with all the LOV columns and everything. And then we can select the distinct values from the pivot column, right? And that's the reason why this select here is done on the whole platform, right? And also all the filters are taken into account. If we are selecting, if we added a filter, let's say, let me add a filter, and let's say the department equals research, right? We can see that only the research column is now selected. So pivoting happens after filtering, and that perfectly matches the way how APEX executes a query, right? Think about that onion concept again. The pivot is the most outer layer of our onion. Everything is executed, and then a pivot is wrapped around this, right? And that's how these queries are built. And so the basic result is first get all the values for your pivot, right? That's what the select distinct does, and then apply the SQL pivot clause. And there are also, for instance, if you there is a limitation on the number of pivot columns, you can only have 3, as you can see, right? No more. And for the row columns, if I'm not, it's also only 3, and you can have up to 8, and you can have up to I believe it's up to 3. No, we have 3 row columns, of course. So there are a few limitations. It's a limitation of, I believe, 8 pivot columns and a given number of row columns, 3 or 8, I can't remember right now. But you might find yourself in a situation where you want to exceed those limits. And you can build your own pivot report, right? Or you want to always provide a pivot report. You don't want the end user to mess up with that. So in that case, you can use that recipe, learn what APEX, craft your own SQL query based on what APEX does with the SQL pivot clause, and then build a plain classic report, which does the same without having the end user to bother with this. So this would be a fixed pivot, and we can now have a simple classic report where we just provide that query as a classic report. And if you don't need all that interactivity, here you are. That's the pivot view as a plain classic report. And maybe for some use cases, that is even the better choice, right? Okay, let's have a look into another example. So I think we have seen enough about interactive reports yet. Let me now head to another APEX component. And I can clearly see that time is running fast. I would now like to show you Faceted Search, because I think that's a super interesting case on how to leverage database functionality. And it's actually, I think it's a bit of a surprise when you have a look what database functionality is applied here. So we can see a Faceted Search. This on the right-hand side is a plain classic report, which just shows us the data of the end table. And I deliberately created all the examples on the end table. We all know the end table, right? I don't need to explain anything about the data in that table. And the interesting bit is the facets on the left-hand side, right? And we can see the distinct values of the job column, of the department column. Again, the LOV is already, the foreign key is already resolved here. And not for the salary, that's not the distinct values, that's the ranges, as you can see, right? So we have one which is below 900, and another three which are between 1300 and 2000, right? And when I'm clicking within those, you can see that stuff happens. It's not only filtering the report, and how filters work, we have learned that already. And but also interesting stuff happens here, right? I click that, and the count here adjusted, right? And right now I added something here, and here the sales count increased by 1, and we only also get counts for accounting and research. So something happens here. The interesting question, of course, is how to compute these counts, right? And we have 3 facets here, and we are again in that situation of getting aggregate values, and not so much for the report. The report doesn't show aggregates, it only shows the data, but obviously we need to get multiple aggregates at once. And let's have another look at our at a few query examples. So let me first start basic, right? So get me counts for the various department numbers. That's easy. Right? This example just uses department numbers, not department names, but if we have a look, that is the same numbers as we can see here. 653, 635. The ordering is different. Okay, let's count for the jobs, right? 24431. Let's have a look. Where are the jobs? 44321. Ordering is different. Same picture, right? So, but I need both of them. Right, and we want to do it as efficiently as possible. Of course, we could do a union again. And, wait a second. Label, the data type, of course. But you could do something like that and get, again, it looks like one query executed to get all the counts, but not really. At the end of the day, the database executes 2 queries. And if your base query is expensive, think about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 facet, then that becomes very ugly. But we have SQL to the rescue, right? Now let me first try to do it all at once. That would be a naive thought, right? Oh, let's just group by both columns. But that's not what we wanted, right? That gives you completely different values, because now we got counts for the combination of job and department numbers. So not what we wanted. But the Oracle database comes to the rescue, and there is a hardly used group by clause, right? and that is the grouping sets. And guess when that was introduced to the database? It was 9i. You're right. Oracle 9i introduced grouping sets, which is almost 20 years ago. And so that is technology, that is functionality, which is part of the database for ages, right? And it allows you, it's super powerful because it allows you to compute multiple aggregates at once. Let's have a look. And here's what we get, right? Exactly the numbers we wanted, right? It's exactly what we needed, and we the result, how the result is returned, is a bit different. But we get one columns with the jobs, and here are the counts for the jobs. And there is rows for the depth no column with the counts for the depth no column. And the job column for those is null, as the depth no columns is null for the job counts, right? We can also add totals to this, right? So just add another one, and here we have our total overall, right? We could also add counts for the combination, right? Would also work. And so this provides everything, right? An aggregate for the job alone, for the depth no alone, the overall job count, the combination of job depth no, and you just pass in what you need. So faceted search only does this, right? Faceted search doesn't need combinations, but it's one single query which executes all this. The final thing is that we need a grouping ID. No, come on. Drop, comma, get, no, comma. So we need a grouping ID and to distinguish. So that's what APEX actually uses. So for each row, we get a grouping ID for the total. And APEX can use that grouping ID to match query results to the facets. And when we have a look into debug mode, we now learned how that works. We can test the knowledge. And this is what APEX does for the count computation. One moment, when we look at debug again, you also clearly see that there are two entries for a faceted search page. One is named show, and that is the basic page rendering and the classic report. The count computation is done using an AJAX request, right? And that is this entry here. So here we see all the SQL which was executed to determine these counts, right? And the query looks a bit complex, right? Again, it's the basic query which resolves also the LOV. But then again, APEX needs to generate a bit of stuff to bucket, to build these buckets for the range facets. And then at the end of the day, we see the grouping ID here. And we see the grouping sets clause over here. And that's the basic thing. All the rest is just APEX SQL generation because APEX has to be generic, of course. APEX generates SQL, which works whatever SQL you provide as your report query. So let me just run that in SQL commands. And here we can see the same as before, right? We see our jobs, we see the salary buckets with their accounts, we see the grouping ID, and that result is actually then processed by APEX, and the counts are assigned to the correct facets. But the working horse for all of this is the database and nothing else than the database, right? Okay, let me show, I think we have to skip the multi-value facet here. Let me show as the last example a bit of JSON and RESTful services. Because that's also a very interesting example on how APEX uses database functionality and how you can do it on your own. So I have a REST API here, which is that earthquake service from the USGS, and we want to integrate that as a data source to our APEX application. So let me quickly do that. So I go to Shared Components, REST Data Sources, and now use the wizard to quickly create a REST data source for that very REST API. And we will see in a minute where database functionality comes into the picture. Right? So let me provide a URL. Next, and I won't do any configuration here, we'll just finish the wizard as fast as possible. But we can already see something here. And obviously, APEX was able to parse that JSON, right? So we see columns. APEX was even able to determine data types, right? And so this is already the data preview. So let me create a REST data source. We now have the metadata. And let me now create a report on top of that REST data source. And then let's have a look how APEX does that, right? So let me create a region. And for simplicity, I'm using a classic report now. It's on the REST source. Let me save that and run the page. And there we are, right? So all that JSON is already parsed and provided as in tabular form to us, right? By the way, how much time did I need to display data from an external REST source, which only comes as JSON, as it was a table in APEX, right? You can see how fast you can be with APEX. But what did APEX do here, right? How does APEX, obviously APEX parsed the JSON, right? That's what we can say. But how? Did it use APEX JSON for this? Some pure SQL thing? And especially, I probably chose the wrong report type, right? Let me change to an interactive report, because now the interesting stuff starts. So when I use an interactive report, I can again add in filters again, right? Let me put larger than 5. And these filters work, right? And we have learned before how filters work in APEX, right? So let's quickly have a look into what APEX generated or what SQL APEX executed. And again, debug will show us. So, and here we see a query which looks quite complex, right? And at the end of the day, it isn't as complex as you might think. The basic thing is, and that's the key for REST data sources, that is, where are we? The JSON table function, which is here, right? And you might have a look into the Oracle documentation for the JSON table column. And JSON table is a SQL function which parses JSON and which projects the data out in rows and columns. And what APEX obviously did, it generated a JSON table query. Yeah, based on what? The JSON table query was generated out of the metadata we have collected when the REST data source was created. So we have the data profile, which contains all the columns and their data types. And when the REST data source is now executed, you can imagine what happens. APEX takes that metadata and uses that to build that REST data source, that JSON table query. And the beauty here is it's SQL, right? It's really just SQL. And as JSON table provides the data as rows and columns, we can now continue doing all the other APEX stuff. We can wrap an outer query. The onion idea comes into picture again, right? The JSON table query is the inner onion. And then a filter is placed on top of this. We can even pivot. I could even create a pivot. There are not too many interesting columns for a pivot here, but I could even do a pivot. I can do a group by, and we can even create faceted search on top of this. So we can now bring all the database functionalities together here, right? And this is also, I think, an interesting example to learn from, because I think many of us developers sometimes have the requirement to parse JSON, right? And it's not always a REST data source. Sometimes JSON is stored in a table and you need to parse it. And whenever you need to parse JSON and you have the requirement to even post-process that data in JSON, in SQL, you want to insert it into a table, you want to further filter, you want to apply a SQL function on top of that. Don't work procedurally, with APEX JSON or these pure SQL JSON object types, use the SQL functionality. Stay in SQL, because that allows you to combine all these functionalities, right? And that gives you really powerful functionality, even for your own pure SQL procedure, for your own functionality. So you might take APEX as a model how to use these JSON parsing functionalities. And I think my time is almost out, and let me stop sharing, or let me go quickly back to the slides. I only have a few final slides, which we are done to in a minute. You'll know this probably. APEXOracle.com. You can try out the things. If you're new to APEX, if we have listeners who are new to APEX, want to try it out, log to APEX, go to APEXOracle.com, request your workspace, and try out exactly these things. So the stuff which I just have demoed, you can do exactly the same thing on apex.oracle.com. You can do it right now, and it's free. What are our customers doing with APEX? Have a look at APEXOracle.com community. And that is all I have. We can now go into questions and answers. And let me finally have a look then. Let me stop sharing.
All right, Carsten. Excellent presentation, Carsten, as always. Thank you so much for taking the time and to share knowledge and work with the community, the APEX community around the world. We have a few comments in the chat. I have one, pivoted grid would be nice. Is one of the comments, a suggestion.
Yeah, that's indeed, so that's a missing feature, right? Pivot is only available in interactive report and not in interactive grid. But with the stuff you've learned today, you can actually do it on your own. So if you can't wait until APEX provides it, you have seen how to generate the SQL query, and you can create an interactive grid based on that. So you can craft the query yourself. You can even create interactive grid on a pure SQL function returning SQL query. So you can do exactly the things which APEX does. First, get the distinct values, craft that pivot clause, and then bring up the interactive grid. The interesting bit about interactive grid is that it's typically editable. And as you have seen, the values of my pivot view are aggregates. So actually, a pivot view is not editable by definition. How should you edit an aggregation value? But interactive grid also allows to provide your own custom pure SQL code to execute on edit, right? So when you save the changes to the grid, your pure SQL code will be executed, and that allows you to take these edited values and to apply whatever logic, right? Whatever logic you need to save those changes. And the total row in pivot, that's the next question which I've seen here. Yep. The total row for each in the pivot view. There was even in the interactive report pivot, there was that switch to show the sum. And that at the end of the day works similar to the aggregate in the plain interactive report view. It just adds an aggregate function to the most outer SQL query to compute those aggregates, and then the interactive report component takes care to display it correctly. But it's at the end of the day, the combination of the things you have seen today. It's the pivot clause, and it's the analytic function to get an aggregate along with the base query.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carsten. And let's see if there's any other questions coming through. In the meantime, also, I would like to let everybody know tomorrow is the last day of the conference. And we have three, if not wrong, 3 or 4 more sessions tomorrow. We also have Chaitanya from the development team, the product management team in APEX, doing a workshop tomorrow. You will be having access to all the recordings, as I mentioned in the start, until April 20. By tomorrow, the recording or Carsten presentation should be already online for you to review. Also, when you get disconnected from the session, we will have also a small survey just to rate or do any comments regarding the session. If you can do leave something for questions. Any feedback will be fantastic too. Saying that, looks like is no more questions, Karsten. In that case, thank you so much again, and please be safe, everyone.
Thank you very much from my side as well. Have a nice remaining conference, a nice remaining day, and I hope to see some of you in the future at a conference or somewhere else. So let's see. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.